Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I wanted to do a review of Claire North's Songs of Penelope trilogy. So this was a fantastic trilogy. I've been going through a big Greek mythology phase recently, and so I've been reading a lot of Greek myth retellings, and this is kind of the last one that was on my list that I needed to get through. And I am so glad that it was, because I really, really enjoyed this whole trilogy. It is phenomenally written. It is complex and interesting and filled with nuanced characters and really great character arcs. So what it is it tells the story of the Odyssey, and it's just the present day stuff from the Odyssey. So it's basically from when Odysseus is trapped on Calypso's island to when he comes back home to Ithaca, and it focuses on what's happening back home in Ithaca. There's a cat here. Each book is narrated by a different goddess. Book 1 is narrated by Hera, Book 2 by Aphrodite, and Book 3 by Athena. And they look at sort of the events going on back home, but also how it ties into the greater political entity of what Greece was at the time, primarily looking at the dynamic between Sparta, Mycenae, and Ithaca, and the different power struggles going on there, and the alliances and betrayals and all that fun stuff. The first two books also line up with the second and third plays in the Orestia trilogy, which looks at the story of Clytemnestra and Orestes and Electra and all that, the fallout from Clytemnestra killing Agamemnon when he comes home from the Trojan War. Book 1 sort of lines up kind of with the second book in the Orestia, and then book 2 in the series lines up with sort of book 3 of the Orestia. And it ties everything together really, really well, because you've got this sort of complicated web of allies and, yes, I know, this complicated web of allies and enemies and power struggles, because Ithaca is in a very sort of vulnerable place at for most of the series, because with Odysseus not there and all of the men on Ithaca having gone off to Sparta, there really is nothing that kind of allows the island to defend itself. And since it's a fairly important island in terms of the trade routes and all that stuff, everyone really wants to get a hold of it, either to claim it for their own or to conquer it. And then on top of that, you've got the yes. On top of that, you've got the suitors and how they're sort of jockeying for position, and how the whole situation with Penelope choosing a suitor, no matter what happens, it's not going to end well. If she picks someone, it's going to end in civil war, as the one who marries her then has to defend himself from everyone else. And if she doesn't pick anyone, then it's going to be civil war anyways, because they're all going to start trying to conquer Ithaca and seeing who can take over. And so it's a really complex, tense political situation. And then the books focus on sort of the interior lives and growth and character arcs of a lot of the characters left behind. So Penelope, Telemachus, even Laertes, Odysseus' father, and some of the maids, and all those characters. So it's sort of like what's going on back home in Ithaca. The series is called the Songs of Penelope trilogy, and we do get quite a bit of Penelope's inner world, but she's not the primary focus. There's quite a few characters and side characters, and each of the narrating goddesses sort of has a character they focus on. So Hera is focused primarily on Clytemnestra, who is sort of intertwined with the events of Book 1. Aphrodite is sort of focused on Helen of Troy, who features in the second book. And then Athena, of course, is focused on Odysseus himself as he comes back in the third book. But what I really love about this series is the way that it follows the overall broad strokes of the events of the Odyssey, but it adds a bit here and there that sort of change how things played out a little bit. It's set up as sort of, this is the real story, and the Odyssey is sort of the idealized version of what really happened and all that stuff. And so in this one, you've got lots of little details that are different, and that's where I think most of the tension and the forward dynamic, and that's where I think a lot of the tension, the plot comes from, is sort of the ways in which this departs from the events of the Odyssey. And it's all little things. All of the big events from the Odyssey do happen in here, and it follows pretty much everything in it. It even includes the final chapter or the final book of the Odyssey, which a lot of people kind of feel is sort of an odd extra thing, and it turns into something really big and incredible. But I like how a lot of the little character moments and the character motivations and all of that stuff is different. So let's get into the review, and we'll go from there. So the first question I like to ask is, do the characters feel like real people? And absolutely. I really love the depth and complexity of all the characters. When they make decisions, it feels logical, and it feels like it really comes from their decision. It's not like the hand of the author pushing people to make decisions. It really feels like this is sort of just a situation that is established and then allowed to organically play out on its own. It doesn't really even feel like it's adapting a story that's already there. It really, really works well. And each of the books is narrated by a different goddess, and the narration allows us to see the goddesses in ways that they aren't usually portrayed. Book 1 is narrated by Hera, for example, and Hera is a kind of unusual character in pop culture because she's either basically like the evil queen from Snow White, or she's just kind of a flat character who's there for kind of no reason. The only real version of Hera that I think works the best in terms of giving her sort of interiority and complexity is the 1960s Jason and the Argonauts, where she's played by Honor Blackman, who's incredible. I love her so much. And in that one, she's allowed to be sort of like, she's likable and she's fun and she's got a sense of humor, but she's also kind of vain and a bit jealous and conniving, but she's not a villain and she's not really a hero. She's just kind of there to add another element to the story as she kind of guides things along. And it works really, really well. And in this one, I really think that it gives Hera a voice that she doesn't often get. Now, I haven't yet read Jennifer Saint's book, Hera, which focuses on her as well. I'm excited to read that and see how it compares to how she's portrayed in this one. But I really liked how the character was given depth and complexity, because Hera in this one is very much, she sort of is, it's described as sort of, she used to be a very primal mother goddess. She was very powerful, and then over time has sort of had to become sort of just the wife of Zeus, and has to kind of do everything that she does while operating within his purview. And you kind of see this in the Iliad, because she, you know, when she wants to do something, she can't influence things directly. She has to sort of find ways to manipulate Zeus into doing things that she wants him to do. And so you get the sense that she doesn't really have a ton of agency, but she wants to affect things on Earth, but she has to do it in a way that works within Zeus's allowance, basically. So definitely the characters felt really complicated and meaningful. I especially liked how things played out in book 3, because there's a lot of things that it feels like if any other author had sort of pushed those characters into those situations, it would have felt melodramatic or done for the sake of emotional impact and not because it's what the characters themselves would have had to do. The author really makes the characters work through their own internal struggles so that when they arrive at a decision, it feels like it's something that they actually wanted to do, instead of just they're being forced to do it because it's what the plot demands. And I really, really appreciated that organic quality to everything. The next question in the review is, did the writing style draw you in? And absolutely. The writing style of this is really poetic and literary, but also each book has a slightly different writing style. There's sort of this really great blend of poetic, literary, ancient sounding, you know, elevated prose, but also mixed in with sort of this modern, ironic playfulness that just adds a lot to the narration, because it's narrated by goddesses. There's a lot of these anachronistic phrases that you'd probably expect to see like in the modern day, and it's not used in such a way as to be jarring. It's used in a way that it fits. But because it's goddesses narrating things, it makes sense that they would use phrases that are sort of out of time, because they themselves are sort of existing out of time. And so it kind of has this fun, dark humor to it that I really appreciated. And it just works really well. In book 2 especially, Aphrodite narrates this one, and she has such a wonderful narrative voice that I think just it's not something you ever see before. Aphrodite is usually portrayed as kind of silly and shallow and everything, and in this one it's very much, you see her as someone who is the patroness of love in all of its forms. So, and that includes things like self-love and free love, and it's not just, you know, flings and relationships. She kind of is concerned about people's self-image and the way that they relate to others, and things like consent, and she wants everyone to be genuinely fulfilled by their relationships. And it's so beautiful. I really love the way that each of the voices of the 3 books adds something a little bit different to the writing style of the book. The books do all feel like a unified stylistic whole, but the different narrators allow for little bits of nuance that sets each book apart and gives each of them kind of a unique flair that I think works really well. So I love the writing style of all of these. The third question is, did the plot move at an appropriate pace? And for that, I'd have to say it is appropriate to the story, but some readers might find the plot movement in the first book and maybe the first half of the second book to be a little bit slow. It does set things up, and ultimately in the third book, it is very satisfying where everything leads. And so you do get a very satisfying finale, and the pacing in this one is quite a bit faster than the others. But it has to kind of build steam slowly, and it gets gradually faster and faster and faster and faster. And so in the first book, it does feel like things are maybe moving slower, but you need that slow pace because you need to sort of get to know all the characters, get to know the situation, get to know the relationships between all the different people, especially the relationship between Telemachus and Penelope, Penelope and her maids. All of those things are really important to how it plays out in the third book when things all kind of come to a head. And so when I was reading the first book, I was about halfway through, and I was like, you know, I'm really enjoying the writing style, but it does feel a little bit slow. And now that I've finished the third book, it doesn't feel like it was wasted time. It genuinely feels like we needed that slow period to make the faster stuff happening in book 3, because book 3 is quite violent and explosive. We needed that slow buildup of pace to kind of ratchet up the tension over time. And so it does work ultimately, but if you're just reading the first book, you might find that it does take its time, but it's worth it, so definitely stick with it. Next up is, were you still thinking about it after you finished it? And absolutely. There is so many wonderful moments, scenes, characters, quotes that just feel they could be written on their own in calligraphy and hung on the wall kind of thing. There's just moments that are really profound, not just about like observations about the world, but observations about mythology in general and stories and how they work. Book 3 especially, you've got Athena, who is very concerned about her legacy and how she'll be remembered. And she kind of is trying to see how she can ensure that she's remembered by linking her story to Odysseus's, and she needs him to kind of allow her to be remembered. And there's so many really wonderful moments of sort of how legacies work and how stories endure over time, and just the writing style in general, but just the overall feel of it. There's a lot of really wonderful relationships. The relationship between Telemachus and Penelope is complicated and really interesting. There's a couple moments where you just want to strangle him, but that's okay. But there's also other side characters. There's quite a few relationships between Penelope and her maids. There's also one of the suitors whose name is Kennemon. He's Egyptian, and he's sort of he's a foil to a lot of the more evil suitors like Antinous, but he is sort of more measured, and he's sort of a really good guy, and he has this really great dynamic with Telemachus that's really wonderful, and it works so well. And so there's all of this complicated emotional stuff, and then especially in the third book when we get Odysseus comes back, and then you get the dynamic between Penelope and Odysseus, and looking at sort of the complexity of what would it be like if you were separated from your husband for 20 years and had to sort of survive by the skin of your teeth without him. What would it be like when he was back finally, and how would you deal with that? So there's so many moments that really stick with you, and I was definitely thinking about this when I finished it. And then finally, the question is, do you want to read it again? And I definitely do. This is one where, having finished it, there's a lot of foreshadowing and a lot of things that are set up in book 1 that pay off in book 3. And so I think a reread would be really worth it, just to see how everything is set up, and to just be able to dive more into the characters that I know eventually will become more important later, and focus on kind of what they're doing, because there's a lot going on. But overall, this was a really enjoyable read, and I loved the writing style, so I think I will for sure read this one again. Overall, I really enjoyed this series. I think there is this thing that I've noticed online where myth retellings that focus on female characters are getting sort of a reputation in social media as being sort of emotionally manipulative and adding things to the original myth just for the sake of inducing rage in the reader on as to the plight of the female characters. There's sort of, if you mention like, feminist retellings of Greek myths, some people online will sort of be like, oh yeah, I know, there's so many of them, and some of them don't work as well. I will say, after reading this, my opinion of Margaret Atwood's Penelope ad has gone down a little bit, because I think this is a much more nuanced, complicated telling of that same sort of story. And so when people talk about, feminist retellings of myths, one thing that they think of is sort of stories that basically just torture the female main character excessively for the sole purpose of eliciting an emotional reaction from the reader. Instead of digging into the complexity of the character, it's more about like, this poor character has been mistreated, and so we're going to mistreat her even more, so you can get more and more angry at how this character's been mistreated. And it sort of misses the point of why people are interested in these characters, because there's quite a few Greek mythological characters that are men that I really, really like. I love, Aeneas and Hector and Diomedes and Bellerophon, and even Jason, as flawed and ridiculous as he is. But there's so many female characters in Greek myths that are just wonderful, and you read their stories and you don't get a lot of information about them. And so the reason why we like these Greek myth retellings that focus on them isn't because we want to sort of get angry on their behalf at how badly they were treated. Now, in some cases that is true, but more of it is just we like the characters and we want more of them, and we want more of their story, and we want to kind of extrapolate what could they have been thinking during this event, or what led them to make this decision or that decision or whatnot. And so there are some Greek myth retellings that sort of oversimplify things too much and turn characters more into caricatures just for the sole purpose of making you angry on their behalf. Now, this series is one that you definitely empathize with Penelope, and you understand the strain that she's under and the struggles that she goes through, but the author doesn't feel like she's just torturing Penelope just for the point of getting sympathy from the audience, because Penelope herself is a complicated character. She does things that are good, she does things that are a little shady, she makes mistakes. She has virtues and she has vices. And so this is, I think, a much more fair and balanced look at her character. And she allows her to be a little messy, which I really, really appreciated. And so if your thought of, Greek myth retellings are it's just going to be shallow and it's going to have a very kind of obvious manipulative emotional agenda, and you want to avoid this for that reason, I would say don't. Give this a chance. These books are nuanced enough that they really do genuinely make you think. Now, there are, of course, going to be awful male characters because Penelope was facing off against a lot of the suitors, and so there's characters like Antinous, which even in the Odyssey is quite an awful person. But then you also have characters who are good and characters who are morally gray and complicated. And so it's not just all of the female characters are perfect and all of the male characters are pure evil and despicable. And now we're gonna, listen to a lecture about how this oversimplified view of this story is the real story. That's not it at all. This is a messy, complicated story. Everyone has flaws. There's very few people who are sort of perfect, virtuous heroes. There's a few people who are very cool, but the cool things that they do sometimes aren't the nicest thing. And so don't see this as an overly simplistic kind of story. Approach it with an open mind, look at the complexity of the characters, and don't assume that it is just oversimplifying thing to women are all good, men are all evil, and that's just how it is, because that's not what's going on. There's a lot more nuance there. So, open mind always. But overall, I will say I really loved this series. My favorite Greek myth retellings before this were 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes and Circe by Madeline Miller. And this definitely fits into that kind of top tier list. Probably my favorite Greek myth retelling is still Circe, but this is probably tied for 1,000 Ships as one of those ones that I will continually remember and will recommend to everyone. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.